Um, a lot of familiar faces here, which is awesome because what we're trying to do is build a community of practice. So we're hoping that as you continue to join us and see each other, that you're maybe thinking about some new things, sparking some ideas for maybe content to bring into whatever sort of programming it is that you do, or even in discussions with people in your community members. So thank you for helping us to continue to build that along with our partners here who you've all become familiar with. We've got some of our regional NASA Earth to Sky team joining us, as well as some folks from the city of Boise, and then several educators and community members. So welcome back. And our tech notes, as we're going to be recording this, and we'll send out those recordings after the discussion today, like we always do. You can pass those around in your community or reference them again. And we have that closed captioning on. If you want to turn that off, you can go to the little CC button on your controls, push the caret and turn that off. Otherwise, it's on for your convenience. And we always encourage discussion, but try to remember to mute when you're not speaking. And then, of course, feel free to direct message me if you have any questions or technical difficulties during our presentation today. So I want to leave most of this time for Stephanie Krantz, who's joining us today. She is an ecologist who works on climate change adaptation and planning for the Nez Perce tribe. So she's done a lot of work in ecology, biodiversity, agricultural ecosystems. She was just talking about how she spent a winter walking 2,000 miles tracking down salamanders. So she has a lot of experience, and she's gone on to apply that to tribal planning. So she's currently based out of Lapwai, Idaho. She described it as a border town though, because I believe she lives in Clarkston. So on that note, I want to hand it over to Stephanie and give her a wave or good thoughts, a warm welcome. And thanks for joining us, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Let me just get my presentation up here. Okay, can you see it? Okay, great. Well, I just wanted to say thank you very much to Jenny and the city of Boise for this opportunity to present today. It's always a gift to speak to people and to meet new people. And, you know, Zoom has both brought us closer together and makes us feel further apart. So I just want to acknowledge that, you know, one day I hope to see you in person, but I'm very interested in your thoughts and feedback about this presentation, and really hope that you will feel at ease saying things in the chat as I'm talking, and, you know, asking your own questions, and, you know, being at home. So I work for the Nez Perce tribe, and before I dive into that work, I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, just to introduce myself. That is if my slide will advance, which it currently is not doing. Here we go. So I am from New Mexico. I grew up in the mountains in the middle of nowhere, and we were very, very poor. The little punk with the attitude on the right is me in the blue coat, showing off my big teeth. When I was a kid, you know, we never went anywhere. We were always stuck at home because we were really poor. And I spent almost all of my time exploring the mountains and valleys and woods in this pinyon, pine, juniper ecosystem. And I absolutely loved wildlife and biology and knew that I wanted to be a biologist. And of course, you know, when I told my mom this, she said, "You will never get a job." And I spent most of my life proving her wrong. I became a biologist, and I got to travel all over the world and had a wonderful early adulthood. But something was missing. I felt like my experiences were for me and not so much helping others. And I also wanted a child. Eventually, I was fortunate enough to find a partner who wanted children too. And, after my son was born, it gave me a new heart, and it helped me to remember my childhood and to see the world through a new lens, both through my own experience of this great love for my child and other children, but also, to really think a lot about the future and what future generations are facing. I've been an armchair activist for a long time. And even while my son was little, we went to all kinds of protests. We were part of the anti-fracking movement in Monterey County, but it wasn't enough. And so when the Nez Perce tribe was flying jobs that both my husband and I could apply for, one for a condor biologist and one for a climate scientist, we jumped at the chance and we both got jobs here in Idaho. I don't often get to talk to educators about climate change and the work that I do. And I just feel like it's important to speak to, how much this work has caused me to think deeply about how climate change is affecting children, and how to talk to kids about it and how to talk to adults about it so that they will believe in it and believe in themselves to do something about it. I also really want to give children hope. So, thinking about my own son, how do I talk to him about climate change in a way that empowers him, but still allows him to experience the wonder, joy, adventure, fulfillment, and love that I have found in nature? And how can I protect cultures that live close to the land and know how to protect the land? And, how can I raise my son to do the same and to deal with extinction and climate grief? So that is why we focus so much on solutions and hope in our program. One of the most stunning images and works of art that I've ever seen to talk about the climate crisis is this image that was created by a French artist. And it shows all of the water on Earth in a ball at the volume of sea level, and all of the air, the atmosphere. And when you look at this image and everything is stripped away, you can see that there really isn't much water compared to the volume of the planet, and the atmosphere is small. And I think if people understood how small the atmosphere is and how small the water is in comparison to the size of the Earth, they would understand better how fragile it is. When I first saw this image, it was presented by Wallace Nichols, who wrote Blue Mind. And Blue Mind is about environmental psychology, changing our relationship with the Earth. And basically what he said is people who spend time in the water and love the water, protect the water. And we need to have blue mind. And I know that Jenny said that she has a blue marble from Wallace Nichols, and so do I. And I give out blue marbles that are light blue and dark blue, a sky marble and a water marble to children. One of the questions that I have for you all is, what does water mean to you personally? How do you experience water? Is it through recreation, bathing, spirituality, farming? What does it mean to you? And if you would be willing to say something about that in the chat and start thinking about that through this presentation, I think it'll lead to an interesting discussion. So, because I work for a tribe, and this tribe has a deep, deep history with water and with species that depend upon water, we think a lot about traditional knowledge. The difference between Indigenous science and Western science, in short, is that Indigenous practitioners do not separate spiritual and cultural values and beliefs from scientific practices and discovery. So as we have looked at climate vulnerability at the tribe, we try to focus not just on the physical properties of water and on restoration, but on the cultural values, beliefs, and traditional ecological knowledge that has led this tribe to believe that water is sacred. Water is used for ceremony, it's a first food, it's used for cleansing and sweat bathing. and it is a sacred source of all life to the people that I work with. So that is where we start. I also think it's important to note that in all of the management efforts at the tribe, ecology and holistic ecological management is key. They focus on ridgetop to ridgetop management that's from the oceans to the mountains. So another thing, or another aspect of working for a tribe that I really like to point out is that the tribe I work for and the tribes in this region have already experienced dramatic changes in the climate. So, this landscape was formed by glaciers and glacial snowmelt. And, the ancestors of my staff have lived through the Ice Age floods, and they know this because of oral history. They have already survived floods, and now they are facing fires. Their traditional knowledge has been incredibly important to understanding how climate change is affecting these landscapes and what can be done. And I think it's important for all of us to seek out oral history, traditional knowledge, and to think about the place where we work from the lens of the people who have been here the longest. In the case of the Nez Perce tribe, the site with the oldest archaeological excavation is about 17,000 years old. It's at Cooper's Ferry, about an hour-and-a-half drive from here on the Salmon River. And this is what this landscape looked like when people formed that village there at Cooper's Ferry. So here are some examples of how the changing distribution, quality, and timing of water is having dramatic effects on species that are sacred to the tribe, that are hunted, fished, or gathered, and on houses and the local economy. At the tribe, facing these kinds of environmental woes from climate change, we're trying to figure out what can be done to retain snowpack, to cool down streams and increase base flows, to create more resilient farmlands and forests, and to protect communities from drought and wildlife. Here is an example of how climate change meets the ecological illiteracy of Western societies. So in all of these pictures, there's some sort of infrastructure that has met water in one way or another without considering the behavior of water or wild species or even farmed species. So for instance, the cow in the upper left got caught up on a fence in a snowstorm and froze to death. The salmon is trying to use the rivers to return to its natal nesting grounds and got caught up on a road that's flooded. The road's in the way of the floodplain. The picture on the right is from just down the street here in Lapway, in which a flood wiped out a huge riparian area and took out a power line during a storm last year. The pictures in the bottom left were taken by my coworkers when they were out doing water quality sampling that show all the mud in the water going underneath the road in the culvert or flooding through someone's residence and agricultural areas. So starting by thinking about how we interact with water and the wisdom of where we put things, I think is really critical for climate solutions. Here are some examples from the drought this summer that show, just a couple pictures of how traditional plants have been impacted by this, and, salmon and wild game. We had a terrible outbreak of hemorrhagic fever here in the Kamiah area, and a lot of salmon facing lethal water temperatures that had to be trucked around obstructions and who had disease because the water was too hot. Finding ways to retain water, store water, and reconnect landscapes and people has become incredibly urgent. because of impacts like these. And to the tribe, these impacts are so devastating that there is no option but to act to deal with the climate crisis. I love this image and this quote of, this elder Western scientist. We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. So how can we change our relationship with water into one that's beneficial instead of destructive? What can water teach us? How can we change our relationship with the atmosphere? And how can we learn to value water in the atmosphere and to defend the sacred, as tribes have so poignantly pointed out? I'm going to focus on the atmosphere for a minute. One thing that has come to me is that the sky is sort of hard to comprehend, right? It's vast. It's made of gas. We feel it when the wind is blowing and the rain is falling, but we can't really see it unless we're in space. This image was taken from the International Space Station, and I love this image because not only does it illuminate that thin veil of the atmosphere around the planet, but it shows, a solar flare hitting the atmosphere and creating the aurora borealis. So in this image, you can not only see how the atmosphere is protecting us from solar radiation, but how it creates incredible beauty. And, a lot of traditional cultures actually worship the sky, and they see the aurora borealis in spiritual terms that are so incredibly beautiful that I'd really recommend looking up some of that oral history. But the other thing to note about this image is that the clouds in the sky are like an airborne river transporting water around the planet. And, as the planet gets warmer, more water will be in the atmosphere, and the distribution of that water in the atmosphere changing is what's delivering our extreme weather events today. So in everything we do at the tribe, we think about how are we going to help get our planet back to a stable climate. In order to get there, we need to get below 350 parts per million in the atmosphere. And, how are we going to do that? Our society is built upon a system of beliefs that honors money and the economy over the things that we depend upon to survive. And so, with that in mind, how can we get people thinking anew about their relationship with the atmosphere and with the land and with the economy? One of the things that we focus on is, presenting this basic information about the atmosphere. There's more carbon in the soil underground than there is in the sky or in the biosphere. That's incredibly important to note. Soil is a huge part of climate solutions, and the organization Kiss the Ground has really incredible videos that are fantastic for people that are doing environmental education. I think also this quote, we still haven't understood that the most important thing everybody needs is clean air, clean water, clean soil, and clean energy, says it all. And it's also by an Indigenous person and scientist, David Suzuki. So when we started looking at adaptation actions, we first looked through the ranked solutions to solving the climate crisis. Most people think of solving the climate crisis as something that's done with solar panels and wind turbines, but actually the way that we do almost everything can help solve the climate crisis. And if you look at these solutions, you can see the ones highlighted in green, almost all of them have to do with food. The ones in blue have to do with forests. The ones in orange are energy. And then of course there's refrigerant management. Unbelievably, one of the top solutions is dealing with our refrigerants. And then of course, educating girls and family planning. So the ones that apply to our area are solar farms, all these agricultural solutions, rooftop solar, tree intercropping, conservation ag, afforestation, temperate forest, regenerative ag, and managed grazing. So that's where we're focusing our efforts. So there's already a huge amount of effort at the tribe to protect water. And I mean, I could talk about the things that are going on here for hours, but I think it's reassuring for people to know that there's already a huge amount of work going on to restore floodplains and riparian areas, to fix these streams and get them back in their channels, to install beaver dam analogs so that the water is cooler, and to restore wetlands, also to help keep the water cooler, and to protect cold water refugia. I mean, literally, there are myriad solutions that are already being applied and experts that are already doing these things. Here's just one example from the tribe. These pictures are from our mussel shell meadow restoration project. This meadow is of particular interest because it's important for salmon and mussels, but also because it's a place where people traditionally gathered camas. So if you will, it's like a traditional garden. And we're working to restore it. So as the climate team, this is something that the watershed division is working on, and fisheries. And the lens that we can add to that is, how can you do this in a changing climate? So we have a whole bunch of projects that focus on this, and I can't talk about all of them today, but I would encourage you to go to our website, and this presentation will be shared, and it has links from a bunch of our projects. So for instance, one of our projects is this climate smart, culturally smart restoration toolkit, in which we have species, their climate attributes, and their traditional value listed so people can plant with the future in mind and increase the climate resilience and also biodiversity offerings of their restoration planting designs. We're doing a climate smart agriculture project that focuses on restoring soil health in order to retain water on the landscape on the reservation. We have this Camas de Condors landscape level climate change adaptation project that's all about reconnecting people to the land and reconnecting the landscape to itself so that animals can move and that there's plenty of opportunity for traditional gatherers. And in addition, the tribe has a completely amazing solar energy project. And I'd really encourage you to watch these videos because they're incredibly moving and you can learn from the people themselves about what it means to them. So the Camas de Condors project, has really just gotten underway. And we have this story map that we created that explains it. And I think that the introductory statements make a lot of sense. We believe that climate chaos is a relationship problem. We believe that all relationships are ecological relationships, and many of them are strained or broken right now. We believe that healing those relationships and convening storytellers and listeners for truth and reconciliation and restoration of species and ancient stewardship practices are a huge part of solving all of our ecological woes, not just the climate crisis. So I really encourage you to check out the Camas de Condor story map. But I'm going to spend the rest of this talk focused on the Climate Smart Ag project. So all the projects we're working on combine these critical elements: capturing water, getting carbon out of the atmosphere, changing our relationship with the land, and changing the focus from problems to solutions. Working quickly to build capacity and to take action, to educate people about solutions and to reduce conflict. Healthy soil captures and stores carbon and water, and it is resilient. If the life under our feet is seen as a relative, we will protect it, as the indigenous peoples of this land formerly did. You know, almost all the biodiversity above ground begins underground. Plants talk to each other through mycorrhizae, and fungus are our oldest relatives. Healthy ecosystems and farms all have one thing in common, and that is highly diverse fungal dominant soil. Restoring our connection to the land literally includes restoring that kind of biodiversity, below ground and above ground and within. So, interestingly enough, one of our projects is to figure out how to get more diverse fungal dominant soil out there to do prairie restoration. You know, in the past, the Palouse Prairie had an extremely dense network of roots and soils and prairie pothole wetlands that had wildlife and frogs and birds, and the people from this region hunted and fished in these prairies, and they know so much about them. It's been so fascinating to learn about these changes from that worldview. You know, this area also has some of the most endangered prairies in the world. And so when we looked at our landscape, we realized that much of the reservation was formerly this Nez Perce Palouse Prairie, and that it's a really good place to focus. There's already a lot of focus on forest and rebuilding forest and restoring forest, and that's an important solution for carbon sequestration. But we're trying to focus on prairies because that is where we can gain the most carbon for our buck and build the greatest capacity to be resilient against flood and drought in the future. Annual winter wheat has roots that are only about 1.5 to 2 feet deep. Its perennial ancestor had roots that are 15 feet deep. If you can imagine turning a prairie upside down, if the roots are 1 foot deep, you're not going to capture very much water and carbon. If the roots are 15 feet deep, you are going to capture a lot of water and carbon and get water back down into the ground. So this is one thing that we're looking at, different types of crops that help restore groundwater and different types of management systems that will help restore carbon to soils in this landscape. One of the things that I like to tell people in order to make sure that they have hope is that a 2% increase in the carbon content of the planet's soils could offset 100% of all greenhouse gas emissions. This is research that was done by a scientist called Ratan Lal. He's Indian and he works at the University of Ohio. So comparing carbon in forested and cultivated soils around the globe, researchers calculated that 100 billion tons have vanished into the air since the dawn of agriculture 10,000 years ago. This process can be reversed, and it doesn't have to take decades to do it. It can be done in less than a decade. And there is a movement amongst farmers to do this. And we're working with several farmers on the reservation who are already putting these kinds of practices, the practices that bring carbon and biodiversity back to the soil, into practice. And they have fared much better during the drought than their neighbors, getting a lot of attention. For each 1% increase in organic matter in cropland, you can store the amount of water that flows over Niagara Falls in 150 days. So, you know, we've come to understand that protecting soil is critical, not only for biodiversity and for gathering, but also for storing water. One thing that I think is little known is that a lot of tribal members gather on the edges of farms in wetlands that have not been plowed. These places have important traditional foods, and so we're working with a farmer to look at the quality of gathered plants on his farm versus his neighbor's farms, because he's doing regenerative practices on his farms and on his farm. And we're trying to figure out how to encourage others to do more of these practices. So, you know, I think it's important to not just think about what adults can do, but how can we teach youth to think differently so that in the future, you know, we can create the paradise that this earth can be. So one of the things that we do is talk a lot about gardens. You know, farming uses half the Earth's land, and we can feed more people sustainably if we use traditional ecological knowledge and change the way people think about a garden. One of the questions that I have that I'm hoping that y'all will answer in the chat is, what is a garden to you? What does a garden look like to you? When somebody says garden, what do you think of? And I'm going to give you a minute to think about it. And just so you know, I can't see the chat at all in my screen view at all. So
We're getting a lot of food answers. We've got food, exclamation point, homemade salsa. Wow, we all put exclamation points. We love our gardens. Tomatoes, a place that provides food, pollinators, summer.
Oh.
Food and herbs and dead plants, herbs and tomato plant smells. We love tomatoes. Maybe we're all mediocre farmers, because I found tomatoes are one of the only things I can grow. Bugs, really great bugs, and a lot of food answers.
Carbon sequestration. Woo, Tristan. Oh. I can tell you that I'm a terrible gardener. I have a patch of weeds that I'm trying to create into, like, turn into a food forest. So, you know, hope springs eternal. I am going to talk about one of the things that I'm doing personally that people can do with kids when it comes to restoring our soil. Okay, well, thank you so much for sharing. Let me just try to get my animation to work here. So to the traditional gatherers that I work with, this is what a garden looks like. So the picture on the left is of a camas prairie at Musselshell Meadows, and the picture on the right is of Zumwalt Prairie, which is the largest remnant of native prairie in this region. It's in Oregon, but it's absolutely stupendous. And both of these pictures have food in them that traditional gatherers use, and medicine, that foods that are visible. They're also both wet meadows. So, you know, Zumwalt Prairie has pockets of wet meadows throughout that has medicines and food plants that are gathered. In this case, this is the drier upland prairie, but the species in here need wet feet in order to thrive. And that's one thing I learned from an elder here at the tribe. You know, many of these landscapes were tended by indigenous people in order to create abundance for themselves and other species. And one of the questions that I often ask myself is, how would I treat other species if I thought of them as my relatives, as my brothers, mothers, fathers, sisters, or cousins? the people that I work with think of these places as relatives. And when they go to these places, they're going to a place that their ancestors have tended for 15, maybe 20, maybe 30,000 years. So they look at this place in a really different way than I do. Another thing that we have focused on in our projects is that tribal members utilize many of the same resources that wild animals do. And so when we think about wildlife conservation and planning for a different future, you know, we're trying to figure out how to get more gatherers involved in making observations of these plants and the distribution of wildlife so that we can understand better where the healthiest soils are, where the healthiest traditional plants are, where the refugia are for wildlife and for traditional plants, what we can learn from native soils so that we can help implement that on farms on the reservation. So here's my small idea of something that can be done with kids. This is what I'm doing for my own yard. There's this scientist called David Johnson, who's now at Chico State University. And he figured out a way to make a composting system that creates this incredibly diverse fungal dominant soil. And they have a citizen science project where they'll put their fungal dominant soil on one plant, but not on another, and then compare the results. And so on the right, you can see this example, the fruit on the left had beam on it, this special soil, and the fruit on the right had regular soil. They've done nutritional analyses of these plants and found that there's literally more nutrients in the food plants that are grown on this biodiverse fungal dominant soil. And there's instructions on their website about how to make your own beam reactor, which would be a really cool project to do with kids. I also think that it's important to note that Indigenous peoples are working to address the climate crisis locally and globally. And there are local tribal climate networks and national ones and international ones. And it can be really interesting to look up some of the projects that tribal peoples are doing. You know, Laura LaMantia is here today from the Coeur d'Alene tribe, and the Coeur d'Alene tribe has an amazing community garden and like one that we really, really envy. That's a really successful project that helps increase their resilience. And, you know, I think it's worth putting a shout out to that. And then also saying that we're trying to emulate some of that here. And all the tribes throughout Idaho are doing different things, but they all have some kind of climate change planning going on. Anyway, I want to leave some time for discussion. And so I just want to say thank you and open it up to questions and discussion. And I'm going to stop sharing now. Oh, but before I do that, I just want to thank our funders and my partners who are totally amazing in every way.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. I know earlier we had a question dropped into the chat, which was people are interested in maybe getting the link to the glacial floods ArcGIS story map. So I know there's an interest in having that passed along.
Okay, I'm gonna find it right now.
And then for the rest of us, I'd say we're a cozy group that know each other pretty well. So if you'd like to raise your hand and ask your questions, I think that would be great. I do understand if you're cooking dinner and you'd prefer to type it into the chat as well. Great, there's the map there, and I'll be sure to copy that to pass along with the recording as well.
It's also in the presentation, but it's kind of hard to see, but it's the best story map ever.
Cool.
Yeah.
And I've spent some time looking at the Camas to Condors map, and I highly recommend checking that one out as well. Actually, I do have a question for you, Stephanie. Could you touch a little bit on that project? Because I think it's pretty unique and ties into the seasonal rounds, which is such a unique thing to the tribe. So would you mind taking a moment to talk about that?
Yeah, so I'm actually going to pull it up here. Okay, I'm going to screen share. Okay, I'm going to move that chat. Okay. So my camera over here, so you can see the messy part of my office. So here's the Canvas to Condor story map. Can you all see it? Yeah. So this project focuses on camas and condors because they're culturally symbolic. It's really about reconnecting landscapes for species on the move. So, you know, it has all this information, background information about the tribe and their homelands. You know, here's a beautiful picture of some Appaloosas overlooking one of the canyons that we're working in. So a lot of the stuff that I just talked about is in the story map, but you know, here's an example of a quote from Nakia Williamson, who's our Cultural Resources Director. "We know we've been here for a very long time. This find, which is the Cooper's Ferry find, is a testament to the long relationship that our people have fostered that has endured a lot of cataclysmic activities, floods, and all kinds of other activities that have happened on this landscape that our people have witnessed." So, you know, we try to focus a lot on traditional culture. There's a huge number of quotes on this map about, you know, from tribal members. So this is from Angela Sandana, who's a Siletz tribal member, but she works for the wildlife division here, and she's the leader of the Condor Recovery Project. The Nez Perce tribe is really interested in reintroducing California condor to Hell's Canyon, but in order to bring condors back, we need a place on the landscape where they will be safe from lead poisoning from lead-based bullets. So this is an example of a relationship problem where, you know, people could shoot pest animals or game with copper ammunition, but they use lead ammunition, which is poisonous. So in order to pull this off and bring condors back, we have to reduce the lead load on the landscape, and that requires a lot of partners. In addition, you know, to make this place safe for them for the long term, we have to make it safe for all kinds of species that they depend upon because they're scavengers. So we talk about that a little bit, but we also talk a great deal about Nez Perce traditional knowledge about how to manage landscapes. So, you know, the seasonal round was a big part of Nez Perce culture. It's how people interacted with the landscape. And one of the first projects that we're trying to get off the ground is this seasonal round trail that will allow us to do cultural-based monitoring sites, looking at traditional plants and their health over the long term, but also educate people about, you know, people that were nomadic, basically, who seasonally traveled and understood ecology, and that's how they survived. This quote out here actually is from my staff person. He's a young man, he's about 40, but this is a perfect example. "The grizzly bear taught us what roots to dig, what berries to eat, which species were medicinal, and which ones make you sick. And its range was everywhere before we messed with its habitat." Here's an image that shows the seasonal round and basically explains it. You know, tribal members traveled all over to different locations throughout the year to get different resources. And that's all woven into their cosmology and their way of life. There's this great slideshow in here that shows, you know, some of that, the system of movement and, you know, quotes and other ideas about it. So I'd highly recommend that. Then of course we talk about climate disruption. and what we're doing to adapt to it. And I don't want to like go through the entire map and give it all away, but needless to say, part of it is figuring out how to reconnect this larger landscape and protect this corridor for species that are projected to be moving north through the Blue Mountains and into the Bitterroots. And, you know, the Nez Perce Reservation and the Nez Perce homelands are at the intersection of this. And so a lot of our focus is what can we do as a tribe to help protect and restore these corridors and make sure that animals can move and plants can move when they need to. You know, here's another example of some of our climate change vulnerability assessing. We realized that the landscape where these prairies are is, you know, has far below average resilience and biodiversity protection. So that's why we chose to focus on those landscapes. Anyway, so that's just an example, and you can see pictures of all of us being goofy and having fun in the wildlife or in the wilderness, and more information about how to protect condors and be a part of restoring them here. And some super cool images of my amazing coworkers living their traditional lives, being awesome.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful resource. So I'll send that link out as well with the recordings from today. Would anyone else have anything they'd like to discuss or chat while we have Stephanie here with us?
Looks like a few hands up.
Oh,
Augie. Laura, maybe?
Yeah, I can go. I just had a question, Stephanie. Thanks for presenting. It was amazing. And I love a lot of like looking into indigenous cultures and indigenous solutions to problems like climate change. But I was just wondering, a lot of us probably aren't from indigenous communities. And are there any good strategies for bringing these ideas into our educational programs and paying respect to these cultures that we're kind of co-opting? So what are some ways you would recommend that we talk about indigenous ideas in our educational programs?
So I think, first of all, that is like the number one question. It's very difficult to do when you're not from a tribal community. However, I think that you'd be amazed how open tribal members can be and how deeply they want to share. I would say the first thing that I would do is go to events that tribes put on, you know, and expect some suspicion at first. You know, these cultures are relationship based. They have to know people before they'll trust people, and investing a little bit of time in trying to get to know your local tribe, your local tribal members. I mean, in Idaho, you can start with the Nez Perce National Historical Park, right? Tribal members work there. It's an opportunity to talk to people. And then you can say, you know, I do this in education and I would like to include more about this tribe. You can reach out directly to tribes and to their cultural resources and education departments. And if that doesn't work, if you know a tribal staff member, like in this group, we have two, Laura and myself, we're both climate change planners. We're very, very nice. We are not tribal members, but we might be able to help connect you. The other thing that you can do is reach out to some of the people in that tribal climate network that I pointed out. Incredibly, tribes are ahead of most people on climate planning, and the Pacific Northwest Tribal Climate Network has all of these amazing plans and whatnot. And so you can look at what tribes are doing. There's a lot of scientists that work for tribes, and just reach out to them and say, I'm interested in including what you're doing to protect shellfish on the ocean, or I'm interested in learning more about what your tribe is doing to protect fish. And then tribes have produced some really cool videos. Like for those folks down in Boise, the Shoshone Bannock has an amazing video about climate change and how it's impacting them. They also have an incredibly good vulnerability assessment and climate adaptation plan. And, you know, you can reach out to them and ask them. That's what I would suggest. I would suggest getting involved with networks that include tribes. Rising Voices is a collaboration between Western scientists and tribal scientists, and it's open to everyone, and it's a great way to meet tribal people. And, you know, it's mostly free or has very low cost participation, and they're really trying to include as many people as possible in the fight for cultural survival. And that's based out of the National Center for Atmospheric Research. So it's a super cool collaboration. So that's a list of ideas, you know, to get you started.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. I appreciate it.
We want to go to Laura. And Laura, you might have something to say on that too.
Yeah, I'm going to put another resource on the side there. If you haven't seen this website, native-land.ca, it's a fantastic map of the Americas and also Oceania and Indigenous lands, Aboriginal territories, and it's able to show how they overlap. And there's the traditional languages of those places, as well as where available links to those tribes' websites. So it's a great resource. If you don't know whose land you're on, it's a great starting place. So, but I had a question for, well, one, thank you, Stephanie. Every time you speak, I have like 5 to 10 new things I add to my list of things I need to do. In terms of the regenerative agriculture, speaking mildly, we have a lot of skeptical farmers. Well, we have a very skeptical community in North Idaho. And I was wondering if you mentioned that they had done better through this drought this summer than others, and that would be such a selling point. And I'm wondering if any of them will be presenting, or if there's an opportunity to connect farmers from your region with farmers to the north, so that they can share their experiences, because I think nobody convinces a farmer better than another farmer who's had a good experience and can say, yeah, we've tried this and it's working for us.
That is exactly our entire strategy right there. Like, we're literally trying to build a network of farmers that talk to each other about what they're doing. Because there are several farmers that are doing regenerative ag, and we're trying to help them benefit from their innovation and taking those risks, but also lower barriers for their neighbors to adopt those practices, and then lower barriers for them to do more by helping them get funding. So, you know, Eric Hasselstrom, who did this incredibly cool thing on his farm, like, it's called he uses this bioactive system where they literally take the exhaust from the tractor and use it to inoculate soil microbes and then pump that back into the ground. So he's capturing carbon, growing microorganisms that can digest diesel. By the way, fungus can digest diesel. And then putting it back into the ground. And this year he harvested garbanzos. His wheat had the perfect protein content. He harvested wheat. He got, 32 bushels of garbanzos per acre versus his neighbor's 13. He ran sheep on his land. He grew a cover crop, a diverse cover crop, and then he hayed it, and it resprouted on its own in July in the middle of the hottest drought on record. So this is an example. This guy literally started this system this spring. They didn't know that they were facing a historic drought. And they're one of the only farms in the region that had a good harvest. And this is year 1. So his neighbor wants to do it, right? Other people are interested. People are talking about him. And he loves to talk. Oh my God, him and his wife. And his wife runs sheep, and they have like a Peruvian sheep herder. So we're trying to figure out how to get them to talk to people, but they're kind of, they don't want to be like Gabe Brown. They want to be like humble, low key, not all about themselves. And we're like, well, could you just talk to some farmers? So yes, we can try to connect you with them. And then there's also another farmer here that's certified salmon safe that's doing no-till, and we're going to go meet with him soon, and we'll try to find out more about what they're doing. And then we're working with another farmer on a manure management system and trying to get him to compost his manure in a way that will get rid of the bad stuff, make it really good soil. So
That's amazing. So
thank you. Yeah, we can't take any credit for it. It's the farmers doing it too. So I think that's really important. Like, this is a farmer-led movement, and they're just suspicious, and they want to let somebody else take all the risks and figure out how to do it before they do it.
Yeah, it's, I think, pretty amazing. Time and time again, you hear what just having conversations can do for people. So I hope he goes out and has those conversations with farmers, and that ties in well to our little wrap up for the day. Thank you for coming to our conversation. We've dropped a link in the chat. Oh, thank you, Kayla, for a survey. This helps us figure out what you're interested in learning, what would be useful for you to learn more about in the future. So we'd appreciate it if you could fill that out. It's real quick. And thank you again for joining us for this conversation. Stephanie, that was really great. I'll be sure to pass along the wealth of resources that you provided for us, and I hope we can talk to you again. So thank you, Rechargers. And our final conversation will be happening on November 29th. And that is with Dr. Sarah Ray, who goes through climate anxiety and how to teach in a time of global warming without overwhelming your students and yourself with some of the things involved with that. So we'll send out reminders. We hope you can join us for that. And thank you for joining us tonight. So bye, everyone. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie.
Good to see everybody.
Yeah. That was really great, Stephanie. You're muted, but
Oh, I said thank you.
I yeah, thank you. That was awesome.
Aw.
Yeah. I feel like I have a week of resources I want to look through now, Stephanie.
Right? I have like 4 sticky notes. I'm like covered with notes of like things to look up.
You know, I also think when you start to look for the solutions, they're everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so, your focus on solutions is so different than what I'm seeing in other places. I mean, you basically just laid out an hour of solutions for this particular place, you know, so imagine what's happening on a global scale. It really does promote kind of agency around change, positive change.
When I talk to children, the number one thing that I say to them is, this is a big problem. It's an adult problem.
Yeah, cool. Like that.
And there are literally millions of adults working hard every day to solve this problem.